So hello everyone. Welcome to part one of the machine learning module of the Introduction to Astronomy course. I'm Aayush, and I will be talking to you about neural networks, what we can do with them, how do we train them, and I will guide you through a concrete example that I developed for you for this purpose. There are many different kinds of machine learning problems that you can tackle with machine learning. The specific kind of problem that I'll be talking about is a classification problem, which is namely you have an XY plane and you have points that are in one region of the XY plane. They belong to a certain class or category. And perhaps those in a different region belong to a different category. This correlation between position and category, what does that have anything to do to concern us? Well, in astronomy, when we have an HR diagram, white dwarfs, main sequence stars, red giants, AGB stars, these occupy different tracks, different regions within the diagram. So it's fair to say that there's a correspondence between the position in an HR diagram and the star's luminosity class and the evolutionary phase. One could ask the question, given the position in the HR diagram, can you tell me what class does that star belong in? Indeed, and perhaps that doesn't even require machine learning, but then, okay, what is machine learning good for? Let's talk about it. So, in traditional prediction methods, for instance, let's say you went to a laboratory and did some measurements. You had data points that you collected over your measurements, and you had a target value that you wanted to predict, a quantity of whatever that you're trying to characterize that you wanted to predict. And now you may have a physically motivated equation, a model, a theory, to which you try to fit your data and constrain the free parameters and read off the predicted quantity that you wanted to get. The problem here is that here you're limited by the patterns you can find are limited by the physics that we know and are incorporating in your model. However, we would like to be able to go beyond that. For instance, I might want to construct a statistical model that searches for these patterns itself and not taking that as input. It would uncover hidden patterns that I might miss out in my own model based on my own intuition. So that's the goal. Now, what exactly does a neural network look like? I'm pretty sure you've seen this kind of image on the internet before. And it's usually in black box, what it actually represents. So let's uncover that black box. This is one of the most basic architectures that a neural network can have for what is called a feed-forward neural network. So basically, you have an input layer, which is exactly what it sounds like. The measurements that you took are fed into here as an input. There are a bunch of hidden layers where your input is processed, and there's a final output layer where you just read off the predictions that you wanted. This could be a single value or multiple values, depending on your design, what you wanted. Now, the way this will work, when we code this in Python, there will be data structures for handling everything. What I want you to picture is, suppose you had your measurements, temperatures, positions, dynamic quantities of your star, color index maybe. You put them in a vector. and that vector is fed as is into the input layer. Then the information in that input layer gets passed on to the next layer in the neural network, the first hidden layer. Now, I wanted to focus on what happens in this step so as to see what's actually going on. What does the network do? Why does it even work? So the information passage and the transformation that goes on is the following. You had a certain node in the input layer. It passes on information, its values, the values it took, to every neuron in the next hidden layer, which is the design of our network for now. And this happens for all of them. So this interconnection and this transformation from whatever vector we had here to whatever we will have here, I can represent that using a matrix form, which is convenient and can be interpreted geometrically. For instance, if I had, let's say, a vector initially, you know from linear algebra that something like this is a rotation maybe and rescaling. And additionally, what you're allowing for are additional free parameters that maybe serve as a bias offset. You could maybe translating your vector. Now, enough for this. But one thing to keep in mind is that now that you've transformed your vector, this is a linear transformation. And if you keep going on like this in your neural network, you perform a linear transformation when you go from here to here, here to here, here to here, here to here. This is all equivalent to performing a single linear transformation using a single matrix and perhaps a single bias offset. But this is not necessarily what you want, because what this would mean is in your input vector, maybe you had temperature, position, momenta, or whatever quantities that you had. Your predicted value, the value you want to predict, may not necessarily be just a simple sum of these numbers, like a1 x1 plus a2 x2 plus a3 x3. It may not necessarily be a linear combination or a linear transformation of the values that you predicted, because in real life, physical systems are highly nonlinear. You could have a logarithmic dependence on temperature. You could have an exponential dependence on a different quantity. You could have a very complicated relationship between one of your input values and the predicted values. So with that being said, a linear transformation is not sufficient. So what happens, as happens in every layer, what you will do when your data enters here and you perform that matrix transformation, you will act on this thing by what is called a nonlinear activation function. This nonlinear activation function is our way of introducing nonlinearity, just a fudge factor that accounts for it. Now, what could such a function be? These are simple functions, actually. The most standard activation functions are things such as a tan hyperbolic, a sigmoid, or something that seems a little more interesting as to, do you wonder whether this is actually nonlinear? It is. But these are some standard activation functions. You apply them, you take what you had, and you operate on what you had with this activation function. And depending on your value, it spits out some number for that. For each corresponding value in your vector, it spits out another vector. Now, this what you had here after this first linear transformation and then non-linear transformation becomes your input to the next layer. So what you have here will be passed on to the next layer. And this is continued in a similar fashion with every layer, each two layers that are connected have their own weight matrices involved. And drawing an analogy with curve fitting, the free parameters here in your neural network are these weights and biases and the bias offsets. And so you do this, and this is continued until you reach the final layer, which is the output layer, where you just essentially read off the predicted value. Now, this is very intuitive because we know how to handle such a problem. In conventional curve fitting, you might have, a known value for what the quantity is and what your prediction is, and you might take the mean squared error. What do we do in this case? Well, one choice is to do something very similar. You define a cost for a deviation from a true value if you know it. For instance, I might give you a data set where I tell you what these values are. You are performing the training. The model has its predictions, and you assign a cost based on the deviation that it has. A good fit would be one that minimizes this cost function. And how does this relate to the training parameters that we had? Well, the predicted value that you have here, because of the weight matrices, just because the output is a byproduct of all these transformations, which involves the weight matrices and bias offsets, is a function of the weights that you had. So in each training step, what you do is you compute the cost function, then you compute a gradient, and based on that, you modify your weights a little bit. Then you repeat the process and keep going until the cost function upon successive steps gets minimized. That's essentially the goal of any training process. Literally, training a neural network is just that, nothing more. In a sense, I could even say that your neural network is a very complicated nonlinear function, an effective nonlinear function, because you had your measured values and you had a prediction. And whatever happened, if we ignore the details of what's happening, effectively, you may have had maybe a dozen layers in your neural network, and each layer may have had 100 neurons. And so in total, there may be millions of training parameters. And so this becomes a space of very, very high dimensional, spanned by those free parameters. So essentially, you have a very high dimensional nonlinear function between your input and output. That's essentially what a neural network is. Does that not impress you? Well, I expected that. After all, because people spend so much computing power on performing the training alone. Collecting the data set itself and preparing that for training is a very difficult task on its own. And then the immense amount of CPU hours for what I just told you is essentially just a glorified version of curve fitting. Well, is that really all what training a neural network is? As crude as it sounds, there are some very interesting behaviors that I would like to talk about. But let's first dive into a concrete example that I want to tell you that I prepared for you. Wait a second. What am I doing? There we go. So, in this Jupyter notebook, I provided with you with the code, and I've given you 3 data files in the GitHub repository. So one of these is a data set that we'll be using for training. It has a bunch of XY values and known true categories that I've given you. And I want you to train the network on that. As just a little foresight, what we'll also do is we will see how good does the network perform on data points that it has not seen before. That is input that is very different from the training data, because this is actually a real weakness of neural networks, and we need to be aware of it. In Python, there are well-established, very well-maintained packages that will make our life simpler. Most of the machine learning part that we're going to do is going to be using TensorFlow and Keras. And I've imported those here. This is the data set. You might be wondering what the true data set even looks like. What exactly is in this data set? So the categories here, each of these square blocks is a category. There are only 2 categories in the whole data set, but each square occupies a separate category. And in the data set that I gave you has this inner region, this part. We'll see why I gave you just that. Okay, now with that being said, let's continue. First thing I want to do is I want to take the total data set and split it into input and output. So my input will be just my XY values, and the output, or labels, let's call them, are the categories represented here using integers 0 or 1. Then we need a data structure that will contain the neural network or model, let's call it. There's a class in Keras called sequential, which provides exactly what we need. I made an instance of that. And let's add our neural network architecture to our network architecture to that. We have an input, which takes us to 2 values, x and y. I have 2 hidden layers. The first hidden layer has 6 neurons. The second has 8 neurons. And my choice of activation function was ReLU. You can try doing the training using a different activation function and see what differences you actually get. And in the final output layer, I have a dense layer of just a single neuron. The activation I'm using here is a sigmoid. And the reason for choosing sigmoid is that whatever value you give it, it saturates at 1. So it takes care of the normalization. Okay, let's continue. And furthermore, we have defined the network architecture. We have defined the activations, the number of neurons and all that. The other things that we need to specify are the loss function itself. The loss function is the same as the cost function that I mentioned before. And although I showed you what was like a mean squared error in that place, here what we're going to use is called categorical cross entropy, or in the case when there are just 2 categories, a binary cross entropy. You could have, since we already are normalizing the final output with the sigmoid activation function, we will set this parameter to false. Otherwise, if you have output from a network that is not normalized, you need to take into account that the values, the predicted values, which are just a sort of probabilities, whether they're normalized or not. So here in case, logits are just, you can think of them as unnormalized probability estimates, but for our purposes, I'm going to set this to false. Another thing that you need to specify is what is called an optimizer. Now, I told you that we have this million or so training parameters. And so while optimizing, we want to find a minimum which is in a very high dimensional space. You know, you can have even a simple case, you have local minima and so on. And while training, even if you had such a very simple case, you might sometimes get stuck here. And there are many other technical problems. We need a way to efficiently navigate to an optimum cost and guide the training in an optimal way. One very famous optimizer is Adam. I suggest you to read more about what it is. But for now, let's continue. We compile that, and in the network summary, it doesn't show me the input shape, but that is okay. I can see that I have sequentially a layer of 6 neurons, 8 neurons, and a final output layer. These are the number of training parameters associated. You can actually even see 6 times 8 is actually not exactly. It's 6 times 8 is 48, but then you also have the bias offsets. So this number of parameters actually just tells you how many training parameters are associated to each layer. Let's perform. Actually, let me clear this for a second. What I want to do is now jump into performing the training. The training happens in a certain way. You have a quantity called the batch size. So a batch, suppose for instance, I have 2,500 data points that I gave you in my complete data set. What Keras will do when you try to fit your model is it will randomly pick a certain number of data points that it will use before updating the weights at each step. And the batch size, you want to use a reasonable number of batch size to make the process uniform and avoid sampling biases. So it will pick out 250 randomly chosen items in my training sample. And it will shuffle through the whole data set and train the model using all of these. One whole procedure that involves a complete use of the whole data set is called an epoch. You will normally have multiple epochs, and here the number of epochs I've chosen is 100. I actually want you to try and change this number because just the way you have problems when you're trying to fit a polynomial curve, such as overfitting, there are similar problems when you try to fit a neural network. So these are very analogous. So here, the size of the data sets was small. Our network is also very simple. So the training happened super fast. These numbers, well, they're nice to read, but you might want to have a visual way of looking at. So what I've done here is as I went along, I wanted to keep track of certain quantities, which will help me understand what happened when the training proceeded. All right. So I look at the history of this training that happened, and I can plot the history and see after each epoch what exactly happened. Initially, there's a more rapid decline of the loss function until you reach a plateau. And actually, even when if you look at the accuracy, initially the accuracy goes up very fast, but after a certain point, it sort of halts. Although it's getting very close to perfection, this is something that will come back to later on. So just hold that in the back of your mind. Now, I've claimed that the training is done. What I want to see is what does the network predict and how good is the prediction compared to the true sample? Well, I'm going to make a grid between which covers four of those squares that I showed you, and then try to see what the network predicts for each of those. And it seems that the network has really nicely learned what we expected. It looks very similar to that, although there are these imperfections and so on, but it seems like it's learning. What would have happened if I had stopped the training at 5 epochs or 10 epochs or 20 epochs? I wanted to try and change that number and see how this output evolves. If you keep the number of epochs low, increase it, how does what the network has actually learned look like? This is a way to investigate that. Well, so far so good. But remember our true distribution, which I didn't tell you what it was. I only gave you this region, this inner region. Is the network able to make predictions in areas it has not seen before? Let's see. For that, well, we can both ask it what it should look like. Sorry, I've both provided you with what it actually should look like, and we will evaluate what the network thinks it should look like based on what it has learned. So when I do that, it seems, well, this is my true distribution, these alternating blocks, but the network doesn't seem to have learned that. It's lacking that. It's expecting the behavior that it saw, like in this region, to sort of continue. Can we do something to alleviate that? Well, let's first start off with training with something that includes those points. Can we still modify the network and have it learn from this unexplored region? Let's see. I'll make the predictions, or I'll ask you to make predictions. Let's see what it's learned. So it seems it indeed is it's getting somewhere. It's noticing some pattern. It has seen some deviation. However, how close does it look? Let's look at the whole range, actually. Well, not so good. What do you think? It has lost the initial block structure it had. We try to fit in this new data. The new data set did not include the inner region, but it sure as hell had like the outer region. In one case, I gave you like just the inner part.
And in the second case, I've given you the outer part. It seems that without complete knowledge of the full distribution, it's really not very much possible to make predictions in the whole range of possible values. So this is actually why people say that neural networks are actually unreliable on data points that it has not seen before. What I want you to do as homework actually is I provided you with a third file, extended training.csv, and I want you to take that file. It has XY values ranging from all the way from -2 to 2, the true values, which will have like the whole block structure. And I wanted to do the training with that, just the way I did. And then I wanted to see, after having seen that the structure alternates once, can it now predict with what we have with our simple design, values further out to -3 and 3? This is something to try. And one thing that I wanted to come back to you, as I said, was there's this problem of what we call overtraining. It may not necessarily be obvious here, but what happens is when you have a lot of free parameters, for instance, we only had like a 6 and 8 layers, neurons in just 2 layers. What you might have is when you have a very large number of free parameters, the network will just absorb what you give it. Suppose you had points like this. You could maybe, if you have fewer degrees of freedom, you might fit in something like that. However, if you allow a very large number of degrees of freedom, what you risk doing is this. Well, it definitely does fit these data points that you trained it on very tightly. But what you might wonder is, well, imagine if the trend actually holds this one. Then this would perform actually really well on things that it has not seen before. But what about the one that we trained here, that we fit here? Outside this regime, it might do something very wild and very unpredictable that we don't even know what it. So overfitting in the case of curve fitting holds just as much in the case of neural networks, and that's something that I wanted to keep in mind. I have additionally left the questions for you down below to think about the actual applicability of this technique in astronomy and some technical questions that you might want to think to deepen your understanding. As a heads up, the part 2 of this machine learning module is actually going to contain the use of real astronomical data, not the problem that I showed you, real astronomical data from the decal survey, the Galaxy 10 data set, and we're going to use those galaxy images to train a network to classify galaxies based on their morphology. That's for next time. And actually, before I leave you, I wanted to point out something that if you were unimpressed by what you saw just here, well, even in rather simple neural networks, sometimes rather interesting structures show up. And perhaps the word neural network, the name, is actually a little bit justified. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Suppose you have this smiley face, and instead of just
categorical classification, you are working on a different problem. This image, I'm going to ask a neural network to learn the features of this image. Now, what does that really mean? Well, this image is a 192 cross 192 cross pixel image. And well, when you have three values that assign a unique color, you will have, red, green, blue. And so essentially what you have is a 192 cross 192 cross three sets of numbers which contain the whole image. So what I'll be asking a network to predict are those numbers. This 192 cross 192 cross 3 numbers, we will flatten this n-dimensional array into a vector and make that an input. When you do that and do the training, I'm skipping that part here. What actually turns out is that if you take the individual outputs of the neurons in the last hidden layer, before the final value, just look at the last hidden layer and the way it combines to give you the final output. If you look at the individual neurons, what the output of one neuron, two neurons, what each of them are outputting individually, what you get is something remarkable. It seems that some neurons, they are useless, while others have actually learned certain features. Like some have learned the eyes, some have learned the smile as well, something like a nose, and perhaps the outer region. And this is with a very simple design. I've skipped the code for that. This is from a lecture series by Florian Marquardt on machine learning in physics. I will provide you with a link for that. But this already hints at how these rather crude approximations for how a human brain learns actually produce very interesting features. Are these intelligent? What do you say? I'm not sure, but I will leave that for you to decide what you think of them, and well, enjoy doing the homework.